Well, good morning to all. When I'm thinking about conflict and forgiveness and reconciliation, I think about where I have been and where I am now. It's always horrifying when you all of a sudden remember things when you're 4, 5, or 6 years old, and you did those ridiculous things like almost start your house on fire, or clip a wire that you shouldn't be cutting. Or maybe you just got upset with my mom making chow mein and I threw that bowl on the floor. While being a pastor here at St. John's, I got to witness 4, 5, and 6-year-olds being upset. And yet we have an amazing preschool teacher that's able to corral them, able to have a conversation with them of what they just did, to let them know that that behavior is not okay, but most importantly, to tell them that they are still loved. And then they go off playing with each other like nothing else had happened, and they are just happy little children for the rest of the time. Or maybe they're just even more cranky and need a nap. However, growing into an adult, we realize that sinfulness and forgiveness and reconciliation isn't as easy. It is something that I'm particularly not good at. Me growing up into the Minnesota nice state, I have grown up into what passive aggressive really means. And that is, we just don't deal with conflict. And we let conflict stir up inside of us and maybe act on that conflict in ways that we later regret. And yet, God still gives us grace. Now, there are people that struggle with it even more. When I was taking my driver's test and learning about what road rage was, it's not really a thing that I see on a daily basis here in North Dakota or Minnesota, but I remember one particular time where I was driving to my parents' house from the seminary and 2 cars drove up right next to each other. And one car was throwing CDs, throwing fast food restaurant bags, throwing anything that they had in that vehicle at the other one. And I promise you this, I promise you what I saw next was the most ridiculous thing I saw, but then the other car, the passenger side person, got out of the car window just enough to take a baseball bat and swing at the mirror. It was a road rage I will never forget, and probably one of the only ones that I have ever seen so far. But I'm thinking to myself, what got them to that point? Where not only were they risking the lives of the people in those vehicles, but also risking my life and other bystanders that were driving on that road in that particular time. In our society today, I think forgiveness and reconciliation is very different to what God's forgiveness and reconciliation means. In our culture, maybe forgiveness and reconciliation means that if you sinned against me, that you should be punished until I feel that you are punished enough. And we see that through our correctional system, where we are no longer trying to rehabilitate people, but trying to just punish them so that they don't commit that offense again. Where they want to make that time in prison so awful, where they would never think of making that offense. And we sometimes think that that is good enough. And yet, what I would argue is that God goes to a completely different path. And we see that in our correctional system, where our most egregious sinfulness, our most egregious behaviors go along with our most serious penalty, where we take someone's life based off of what happened, based off the sinfulness that they have committed. And what I want to focus on is that when the family members that are the witnesses of that taken of life in that prison system, when they are asked, was it worth it? Was taking the life of the sinful going to fill that hole in your heart? Is everything back to normal now? Some will say yes, but there is also a resounding no. That hole is still in my heart, that my family member is not back in my home because that person's life was taken. Things are not the way that I thought it was going to be once that penalty was executed. I think that when we talk about forgiveness and reconciliation in our culture, I hear the words forgive and forget. And I think that truly makes sense when we're talking about that forgiveness and reconciliation is about the punishment of someone else, where they have to feel the pain of the sinful behavior that they cause to their neighbor. And yet, that is not what God is about. God is not about punishment. God is not about seeing how much the other person can suffer because of their behavior. It is not about grounding them for life. It is not condemning them to hell. What it is about is that they are receiving the grace of God, that they are receiving the love that they need to be better people. When we talk about human sinfulness, and we're talking about relationships and conflict between one another, sometimes the bridges can't be rebuilt, and certainly not rebuilt in the same way. But yet, God, when it comes to reconciliation and forgiveness for our neighbors, is putting everything on the altar. Putting everything on the altar and recognizing your pain and your guilt and your brokenness, and trying to find reason of what exactly happened. It is about recognizing the sinful behavior that inflicted on you, or that you inflicted on one another, but allowing God in the midst of that conflict. See, God is not talking about inflicting more pain and more suffering. God is about finding ways where you can grieve of that broken relationship or that conflict that has ensued. When it comes to forgiveness and reconciliation, it is about grieving. It is normal to be mad. It is normal to be sad. It is normal to make compromises. And God recognizes that process for each and every one of you. But most importantly, through that grieving process and through you processing your emotions and processing what has been going on, is not about impacting the other person. It's not about changing the other person. It's about changing yourself. See, after that sinful behavior was inflicted on you and you are going through this grieving process and you're putting everything on the altar and asking God for the strength to keep moving forward, it is not about changing the neighbor that inflicted the pain. It is about changing yourself. It is about accepting yourself. It is about accepting yourself and saying, you are okay. You are okay. You are enough. You are loved. What I have seen through the times where I have been in conflict is that my own life baggage gets in the way. That the brokenness that I have been impacted with years before that behavior ever impacted me, or that neighbor has ever impacted me, is influencing that situation in that moment. And that is where God is the most impactful when it comes to our conflict. That God is telling us that we are enough. So that baggage and that resentment and that shamefulness that we have always carried is not impacting our reconciliation for ourselves. It is not impacting the way that we view ourselves. It's not impacting our own identity. There are certain behaviors that cannot be undone and cannot be rebuilt. And I understand that. And that is okay. But it is about how we go into this world, how we re-enter into this world, where we re-enter into society with the relationship with God and with the relationship with each other. That is what's important. It's about us being healthy. It's about us feeling that we are enough and feeling that God is continually being with us and making us the best person that we possibly can be. And continue being disciples of Christ. And continuing to serve our neighbor and to love our neighbor, even if our neighbor has sinned against us. It is about recognizing our own brokenness. And recognizing that we need God's grace. It's also recognizing that we are all in this together. When 2 or 3 are gathered, that is where God's presence comes. What we have to know is that we are like that one last sheep that is lost. That God doesn't say, forget that person. God says that you are worth it to go looking for. That even though through the sinfulness of other people on you, that you might feel lost, that you might feel abandoned, that you might feel that you will never get back to where you were. But God is reminding us that He has made this community of believers to raise each other up, to leaning on each other, and through the grace of God, we are enough. Amen. I invite us to stand as we are able, as we sing together, Lord of all nations, grant me grace, number 716.